1945, Soviet and American soldiers met on the banks of the Elbe River near Strela, Germany. On April 25, 1945, they became allies on the ground. Together, they had defeated Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union had lost an estimated 26.6 million people in the war, with the wartime Soviet-era official figure of 20 million. Entire cities had been destroyed, entire generations had been wiped out. At that moment, few could have imagined that within a few years, the wartime alliance would collapse, and the two sides would spend decades preparing for the possibility of fighting each other. Today, Russia is often described as the West's principal geopolitical rival. NATO is expanding its military capabilities. European countries are rearming. Russia is under some of the most extensive sanctions ever imposed on a major economy. And even now, more than 4 years after the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the confrontation continues to shape global politics. The European Union has approved more than 20 sanctions packages against Russia, and NATO continues discussions about strengthening Europe's defense posture amid concerns about future Russian threats.
A strong Europe is a strong NATO, and we are determined to fill the gaps that we see in the defense posture.
So how did we get here? How did a wartime ally become the West's enemy? The answer begins not with Vladimir Putin or Ukraine or even the Soviet collapse. It begins with the end of World War II.
The heroic defense of Stalingrad. The Soviet army turning the Nazi 6-month assault into the most ghastly military disaster in German history. Hands held high, the beaten Nazis pour from house after house in abject surrender.
When the war ended in 1945, only two powers emerged truly dominant: the United States and the Soviet Union. But while they had shared an enemy, they did not share a vision of the future. The United States promoted liberal democracy, capitalism, and open markets. The Soviet Union promoted communism, one-party rule, and state-controlled economies. As Soviet-backed governments emerged across Eastern Europe, fears grew in Western capitals that Moscow was expanding its influence far beyond its borders. In 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. The Cold War had begun.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
There were, of course, missed opportunities, but I think ultimately the two sides faced a situation that had never happened before, which is that the United States had a large number of troops in Europe, and the Soviet Union expected that they would go home within a couple of years, but they decided to stay. And this posed a problem in terms of the way the Soviet Union viewed Europe, the situation in Europe. And it was seen as something that was never worked out at the Yalta Treaty or the Potsdam Treaty. And then they really didn't know how to deal with it. I think also that Stalin was innately suspicious of the Western allies anyway. He felt that at some point they would probably get together against the Soviet Union, or at least try to limit Soviet control over Eastern Europe and influence over those countries in that bloc. So it wasn't inevitable, but I think it was quite likely.
What followed was not a direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it was a global contest for influence. Both sides built vast nuclear arsenals. Both sides ran espionage networks. Both sides funded allies and fought proxy wars from Korea and Vietnam to Afghanistan and Africa. The rivalry came closest to catastrophe during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. For nearly half a century, East and West viewed each other through the lens of existential threat. Then suddenly, the Cold War ended. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. For many in the West, this was seen as the triumph of liberal democracy. For many in Russia, it felt very different. The 1990s brought economic collapse, hyperinflation, political instability, and the rise of powerful oligarchs. Millions saw their savings wiped out. State institutions weakened. Russia lost not only territory, but also much of its global influence. That decade left a deep mark on the Russian political establishment. Many concluded that Russia had been weakened, humiliated, and excluded from the European security architecture that emerged after the Cold War. At the same time, NATO was changing. Created in 1949 to deter Soviet expansion, the alliance began admitting former Warsaw Pact members and former Soviet republics after the Cold War ended. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999. The Baltic states joined in 2004. More countries followed in later years, including in enlargement waves in 2009, 2017, and 2020. Western governments argue that sovereign states have the right to choose their own alliances. Many Russian leaders saw something else. They saw a military alliance moving steadily closer to Russia's borders. This became one of the defining disagreements of the post-Cold War era. To many in the West, NATO expansion was about security. To many in Moscow, it looked like encirclement.
Yeah, although, I mean, it's fair to say that when the initial expansion began to take place, particularly from 1994, 1999, 2004, there weren't too many complaints from Russia. I mean, really, even when Putin was there by 2004, there was no real uproar when it happened. And similarly, more recently, when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, you didn't get many protests from Russia either. So I'm inclined to think that the matter of NATO expansion is something of an excuse from Russia. It's not the real reason why Ukraine was invaded, and that NATO has not posed a direct threat ever to Russia. It may have posed a threat to places like Serbia, which are traditional allies of Russia. But I don't think that threat was the reason why we have a war today.
This is where Vladimir Putin enters the story. Putin became Russia's acting president in 1999 and president in 2000. His central promise was simple: restore stability and restore Russian power. Under Putin, the Russian state became stronger and more centralized. The economy recovered, helped by rising energy prices. Russia reasserted itself on the world stage. But it also became increasingly confrontational with the West. The turning point came in a series of escalating crises. In 2008, Russia fought a brief war with Georgia. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea after political upheaval in Ukraine. The move was condemned by Western governments as a violation of international law and triggered the first major wave of sanctions. At the same time, conflict erupted in eastern Ukraine. Relations never fully recovered. Meanwhile, Western intelligence agencies accused Russia of cyber operations, disinformation campaigns, and interference in democratic elections, including the 2016 US presidential election. Russia rejected many of these accusations, but mistrust deepened.
Well, again, the breakdown was gradual. There are turning points when attitudes in both Washington and Moscow changed significantly, and ideas about how to manage the relationship changed in ways that moved from what both sides hoped would be partnership in the initial post-Cold War period to a more adversarial relationship. So one of the key turning points from the standpoint of the Kremlin is actually 2004, and it's bookmarked by two major events: the Beslan terrorist attack in the South Caucasus in September of 2004, which led Russia to conclude that the United States really wasn't interested in counterterrorism cooperation, and that was only a smokescreen for eroding Russian influence in its own geopolitical space. And the other event was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which Russia interpreted as an effort by the United States to rip Ukraine out of Moscow's orbit, and those two events led to a significant reassessment within the Kremlin over the goals of American policy and how close Russia could work with the United States on a whole range of issues. So that was a significant turning point for Russia. The turning point for the United States, I think, actually comes in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea, and the understanding in Washington that the effort to integrate Russia into the Euro-Atlantic community as a free market democracy had failed, and that a different approach was needed to Moscow. And so those two events, 2004, 2014, I think erode ideas of partnership, lead to increased friction in the relationship. And obviously, the pathway from 2014 to February 2022 is one that is fraught with increasing tension between the two countries, Now what we have as a result of Russia's large-scale aggression against Ukraine is a profoundly adversarial relationship.
Then came February 24th, 2022. Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For many Western governments, this was the moment that transformed Russia from a strategic competitor into a direct threat to the European security order. The response was unprecedented. Sanctions targeted Russian banks, energy exports, technology imports, and state officials. Western countries sent billions of dollars in military and economic assistance to Ukraine. Europe accelerated efforts to reduce its dependence on Russian energy. Finland joined NATO in 2023 and Sweden in 2024, ending decades of military non-alignment. The divide between Russia and the West became deeper than at any point since the Cold War. But there is another side to the story. Russia argues that many of its actions were driven by security concerns. Russian officials have repeatedly cited NATO expansion, Western military interventions, and what they view as attempts to limit Russia's influence.
A powerful military bloc appearing near our borders will be perceived in Russia as a direct threat to the security of our country. Statements claiming that this process is not directed against Russia are not satisfactory to us.
Western governments reject that argument. They contend that sovereign states have the right to choose their own alliances and that Russia's military interventions represent aggression rather than self-defense. That is what international relations scholars call a security dilemma. One side takes action to make itself safer, the other side interprets that action as a threat. Both respond by taking further measures, and the cycle continues.
Well, it's a combination of both, but there are significant geopolitical differences between the two countries. The United States has wanted to expand its influence in Europe, to expand the sway of liberal democratic values, and that includes in areas that are part of the former Soviet Union. Russia sees its preeminence, certainly in the former Soviet Union, as critical to its own security. So there's a fundamental tension between what the United States wants to do as part of its foreign policy and what Russia sees as essential to its own security. And that tension is seen, I think, most dramatically in the way both sides have approached the conflict in Ukraine.
In many ways, that dynamic explains why the relationship has become so difficult to repair. The Russia-West rivalry is a product of decades of accumulated mistrust, a rivalry shaped by World War II, institutionalized during the Cold War, reignited after the Soviet collapse, and transformed by conflicts from Georgia and Crimea to Ukraine.
I hesitate to use the term the new Cold War because that leads, I think, to a misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict, the context in which it takes place, and what the possible policy solutions are at this point. First thing to remember is that the U.S.-Russia relationship is not the axis of international affairs at this point, the way it was during the Cold War. United States-China is the axis of international affairs. That's one. Two, the Cold War was primarily bilateral confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that had both geopolitical and ideological elements to it. The U.S.-Russian conflict at this point exists in a world that is probably closer to multipolar than it is to bipolar. And that creates a whole different set of challenges for managing the relationship. It also means, for example, that the policy of containment which the United States pursued with great success during the Cold War is not adequate to the challenges of the current period. You can't contain Russia in a multipolar order when significant actors such as China and India are not interested in containing Russia. So I think the Cold War is a misleading analogy and leads to poor policy prescriptions.
Today, Russia and the West are not engaged in a Cold War in the exact sense that existed during the 20th century. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism is gone. But the struggle over power, influence, security, and competing visions of international order remains. Which is perhaps why one of the most important questions in global politics is no longer how this rivalry began. It is whether either side still knows how to end it.
Being rivals doesn't mean the relationship can improve. There are different ways of conducting rivalry or managing competition between the two countries. So you can have competition that is destructive. You have competition that is constructive. If you're looking for an analogy, think about how economics work. You can have two big companies that are producing the same product, can be rivals, but neither one has any interest in destroying the market that they sell into. And so they manage their competition in ways that enable the continued survival of the market that they need to sell into, as well as maintaining the survival of both companies. So something similar can occur with U.S.-Russian relations. That is, an understanding that we are going to be competitors, but we each have an interest in continuing to survive. There are areas where we need to cooperate in order to ensure that survival. There are guardrails that need to put on our competition to ensure that it doesn't spill over into direct military confrontation, which is always fraught with the risk of a nuclear cataclysm. So, the challenge is not to eliminate the rivalry. The challenge is to manage the rivalry responsibly.
For all his bizarre behavior, Trump has shown that the leaders can talk to each other. I mean, they had this meeting in Alaska. They've been on good terms. They phone each other all the time. So there's no personal animosity between the Russian and American leaders. And I think that Putin and Russia perhaps fear Trump losing power over the Congress and the Senate in the November elections, which would isolate him and reduce his power. And also perhaps Trump disappearing from the political scene altogether, whether through illness or death or some other reason. Impeachment, I might say, is always a possibility with Trump. And if that happens, then you could have much more animosity given what Russia is doing. I mean, this is a direct invasion of a sovereign country. And under Trump, the United States has chosen no longer to defend it, not to take part in it anymore, but only peripherally to take part in some kind of peace protest that leaves Russia with 20% of Ukrainian territory. So by any standards, I mean, that's unusual behavior for the United States. And you think back to the invasions of Iran and Iraq back in the early period of the 20th century. And the United States today, when Trump first came in, vowed to pull out of any conflicts and not to start any international wars. They've gone way back on that with their attack on Iran. And also, capturing Maduro of Venezuela and bringing him back to New York for trial. All these things suggest a completely, I would say, unpredictable US foreign policy with Trump in command. The Europeans are fairly standard. We know what they want. They're still standing for democracy. They want all countries, I think, that left the Soviet Union to be given a chance to develop as they see fit and not to be controlled by Russia. And I would say recently we've also seen in elections in Hungary, in more recently in Armenia, that the pro-Russian candidates have not done very well. Orban has left office, and the president of Armenia was renewed for another term. In Moldova, another peripheral country, you have a pro-EU president who's now in a sixth year. The leader of Syria has fled to Russia. So all the traditional allies of Putin are sort of left the scene, and I feel like he's lost his grip. Certainly Russia's losing a lot of influence and may resort to some desperate measures to try to change that. One of them possibly being forced conscription, one of them possibly use of tactical nuclear weapons and Oreshnik missiles over Ukraine. So that's it. I think it's a very difficult situation. But I think the inconsistencies in the White House are the major factor, because we really don't know what will happen next.